Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in 1889 in Austria. His early life was unstable and filled with frustration. He struggled in school and failed to get into art school in Vienna, something that deeply affected him. During these years, he developed many of the extreme nationalist and anti-Semitic beliefs that would later define his ideology. In 1914, World War I began, and Hitler volunteered to fight for Germany. The war had a profound impact on him. Germany's defeat in 1918 left him bitter and angry. Like many others at the time, he believed Germany had been betrayed by politicians and minorities rather than defeated militarily. After the war, Hitler joined a small political group called the German Workers' Party, which later became the Nazi Party. He quickly stood out as a powerful speaker. His speeches blamed Germany's problems on Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles. His message resonated with people who were struggling during Germany's economic collapse. In 1923, Hitler attempted to overthrow the German government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch.
In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, they decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison.
The coup failed, and Hitler was arrested. During his time in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, where he laid out his vision for Germany, including expansion, dictatorship, and racial purity. After being released, Hitler changed his strategy. Instead of seizing power through violence, he focused on gaining it legally. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazi Party gained popularity as Germany faced economic crisis and political instability. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he dismantled the democratic system and turned the country into a dictatorship. Political opponents were arrested, free speech disappeared, and the Nazi regime took total control of society. Over the next decade, Hitler pursued aggressive expansion across Europe. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II. The war would eventually spread across continents and lead to tens of millions of deaths. At the same time, Hitler and the Nazi regime carried out the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others including Romani people, disabled individuals, and political opponents. By 1945, the war had turned completely against Germany. Allied forces were closing in from the west, while the Soviet army was advancing from the east. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler retreated into an underground bunker beneath the city. Inside the bunker, the situation became increasingly desperate. Germany was collapsing, and the Soviet army was only blocks away. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in the bunker. The ceremony was brief. Everyone inside knew the end was near. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Braun took poison, while Hitler shot himself with a pistol. Their bodies were carried outside the bunker, placed in a shell crater, and burned by Nazi officials according to Hitler's instructions. Soviet troops discovered the remains shortly afterward. By the time Hitler died, Germany was already defeated. His death marked the final collapse of the Nazi regime and the end of his 12-year dictatorship. Hideki Tojo was born in 1884 in Tokyo, Japan. He came from a military family, and from a young age, his future was already pointing toward the army. His father was an officer, and Tojo followed the same path by entering military academy and eventually joining the Imperial Japanese Army. Tojo was known as extremely disciplined, strict, and loyal to authority. He built a reputation as a hard-working officer who believed strongly in Japanese nationalism and military strength. Over time, he moved up the ranks and became involved in military leadership during a time when Japan was rapidly expanding its influence across Asia. During the 1930s, Japan invaded parts of China and began building what it called a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was essentially an empire across Asia under Japanese control. These campaigns were incredibly brutal, and Japanese forces committed numerous war crimes against civilians and prisoners. Tojo strongly supported this expansion. His political influence grew, and by 1940, he had become Japan's Minister of War. In 1941, he became Prime Minister of Japan. At this point, tensions between Japan and the United States were extremely high. Japan had already occupied large parts of China and Southeast Asia, and Western countries responded with economic sanctions, including cutting off vital oil supplies. Japan's leadership believed war with the United States was becoming unavoidable. On December 7th, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack destroyed several ships and killed more than 2,400 Americans. It also brought the United States directly into World War II. Although Emperor Hirohito was still the official head of state, Tojo became the public face of Japan's wartime government. Under his leadership, Japan continued expanding across the Pacific, capturing territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. However, the war eventually turned against Japan. After major defeats such as the Battle of Midway in 1942 and the steady advance of Allied forces across the Pacific, Japan's military situation became increasingly desperate. Cities were heavily bombed, resources were running out, and the country was slowly being pushed toward defeat. In 1944, After a series of military disasters, Tojo was forced to resign as prime minister. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Allied forces began arresting top military and government leaders for war crimes. American troops soon arrived at Tojo's home to arrest him. Knowing this was coming, Tojo attempted to commit suicide. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol. However, the bullet missed his heart, and he survived the attempt. American soldiers rushed him to a hospital, where doctors treated him and saved his life. Tojo would later say he regretted failing to die, and that he believed it would have been more honorable. Instead, he was taken into custody and placed on trial at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. The trial lasted for years and examined Japan's wartime actions across Asia. Tojo was found guilty of multiple war crimes, including waging aggressive war and responsibility for atrocities committed by Japanese forces. He was sentenced to death. On December 23, 1948, Hideki Tojo was executed by hanging at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. His death marked the end of one of the most powerful figures in Japan's wartime leadership, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was born in 1883 in a small town in northern Italy. His father was a blacksmith and a passionate socialist, and his mother was a schoolteacher. As a young man, Mussolini was rebellious and often got into trouble. He worked various jobs and spent time in Switzerland after leaving Italy to avoid military service. In his early years, Mussolini was actually involved with socialist politics and even worked as a journalist for socialist newspapers. However, his views changed dramatically during World War I. While many socialists opposed the war, Mussolini supported Italy's involvement and believed war could strengthen the nation. This shift eventually led him away from socialism and toward a new political ideology that focused on nationalism, authoritarian leadership, and militarism. That ideology would later be known as fascism. After World War I, Italy was politically unstable. The country faced economic problems, protests, and fear of communist revolution. Mussolini took advantage of this chaos. In 1919, he founded the Fascist Party and created paramilitary groups known as the Black Shirts. These groups violently attacked political opponents, especially socialists and labor organizers. In 1922, Mussolini and thousands of his supporters marched toward Rome in what became known as the March on Rome. The Italian government was weak and feared civil war. Instead of stopping him, the king invited Mussolini to become prime minister. Once in power, Mussolini slowly dismantled democracy. Political parties were banned, censorship was introduced, and opponents were imprisoned or killed. By the mid-1920s, Mussolini had turned Italy into a dictatorship and called himself Il Duce, meaning the leader. During the 1930s, Mussolini tried to expand Italy's power by invading other countries. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia in a brutal war that involved chemical weapons and massive civilian casualties. Around the same time, Mussolini grew closer to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. The two dictators formed a political and military alliance that would later become part of the Axis powers during World War II. When the war began, Italy joined Germany in fighting against the Allied powers. However, Italy's military performed poorly in many campaigns, and the country suffered heavy losses. By 1943, the situation had become disastrous for Italy. Allied forces invaded the country, and many Italian leaders lost confidence in Mussolini. In July 1943, Mussolini was removed from power and arrested by his own government. For a brief time, it seemed like his rule was over, but Germany intervened. Hitler ordered a daring rescue mission, and German commandos freed Mussolini from captivity. He was placed in charge of a puppet government in northern Italy known as the Italian Social Republic. However, this regime had little real power and depended entirely on German military support. As the war continued, Germany began collapsing under Allied pressure. By 1945, it was clear the Axis powers were losing. In April 1945, Mussolini attempted to flee Italy with his mistress, Clara Petacci, hoping to escape to Switzerland. However, while traveling with a convoy of German soldiers, they were captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. The next day, on April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by firing squad, but it did not end there. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down from a metal structure in a public square. Crowds gathered, insulting the bodies and throwing objects at them. For many Italians, this moment symbolized the end of fascist rule and the anger people felt after years of war and dictatorship. Mussolini's rise had been dramatic, but his fall was even more brutal. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is one of the more interesting dictators on this list because, unlike many others, his downfall and death were filmed, documented, and broadcast to the entire world in real time. Saddam Hussein was born in 1937 in a small village in Iraq. His early life was rough. He grew up poor, was exposed to violence early on, and developed an obsession with power and control. As a young man, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a political group focused on Arab nationalism and socialism. This party would become the backbone of his rise to power. In the late 1950s, Saddam was involved in a failed assassination attempt against Iraq's prime minister. The attempt failed, but instead of ending his career, it made him more well-known inside the party. He fled the country, avoided execution, and eventually returned years later when the Ba'ath Party successfully took control of the government. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Saddam had positioned himself as one of the most powerful figures in Iraq. In 1979, he officially became president. Almost immediately after taking power, he held a meeting with top officials where he accused dozens of them of treason. Many of those people were arrested and executed. This set the tone for his rule. Under Saddam, Iraq became a brutal police state. Political opponents were tortured or killed. Entire families could be punished for one person's disloyalty. Saddam used chemical weapons against civilians, including his own population. One of the most infamous examples was the use of poison gas on Kurdish villages, killing thousands. Despite this, Saddam maintained power for decades. Some Iraqis saw him as a strong leader, while others lived in constant fear. His regime survived wars, uprisings, sanctions, and international pressure. Everything changed in 2003. The United States and its allies invaded Iraq. Baghdad fell quickly, Saddam's government collapsed, and Saddam himself disappeared. For months, no one knew where he was. Rumors spread that he had fled the country or was hiding with loyalists. In December 2003, U.S. forces found Saddam hiding in an underground bunker near his hometown. He was dirty, disheveled, and completely powerless. The man who once ruled Iraq with fear was pulled from a hole in the ground. Saddam was put on trial by an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity, including the execution of 148 men and boys in 1982. The trial was chaotic, emotional, and heavily criticized, but it ended with a guilty verdict. Saddam was sentenced to death by hanging. On December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed. The execution was recorded on a cell phone and quickly leaked online. In the footage, Saddam appears calm. He refuses a blindfold. Moments later, the execution is carried out. Depending on who you were, Saddam's death was either justice finally being served or a massive injustice. But one thing was clear. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades and was responsible for creating one of the most brutal and paranoid regimes in modern history. Unlike many dictators who died through violence or execution, Stalin died in a much stranger and more unsettling way. Stalin was born in 1878 in the small town of Gori, in what is now Georgia. His childhood was harsh. His father was abusive. His family was poor, and he grew up in an environment filled with instability and violence. As a young man, Stalin became involved with revolutionary groups opposing the Russian Empire. He eventually joined the Bolsheviks, the faction led by Vladimir Lenin that aimed to overthrow the Russian government. Stalin wasn't known as a great theorist or public speaker like some of the other revolutionaries. Instead, he was known for being ruthless, patient, and extremely strategic. After the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the formation of the Soviet Union, Stalin slowly climbed the ranks of the Communist Party. When Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle began between several leaders over who would control the country. Stalin outmaneuvered them all. Over the next few years, he eliminated his rivals one by one, using political manipulation, exile, imprisonment, and eventually execution. By the late 1920s, Stalin had complete control of the Soviet Union. Once in power, Stalin launched massive programs to industrialize the country. Farms were forcibly collectivized, meaning peasants were forced to give up their land and work on large state-controlled farms. The policy caused widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine, where millions of people died. But the most terrifying period of Stalin's rule came in the 1930s, during what became known as the Great Purge. Stalin became increasingly paranoid and convinced that enemies were hiding everywhere, even within his own government. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested, tortured, and executed. Many more were sent to labor camps known as gulags, where countless prisoners died from starvation, exhaustion, and brutal conditions. Even high-ranking military leaders, government officials, and longtime allies were not safe. Anyone could be accused of being a traitor. Despite the terror, Stalin remained in power through World War II. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the country suffered enormous losses. Entire cities were destroyed, and millions of soldiers and civilians were killed. Eventually, the Soviet Union pushed the German army back and played a major role in defeating Hitler. After the war, Stalin emerged even more powerful, expanding Soviet influence across Eastern Europe and beginning what would become the Cold War with the West. By the early 1950s, Stalin was in his 70s, but still ruled the country with absolute control. However, his paranoia had only grown worse. He began planning new purges and investigations against doctors, government officials, and even members of his inner circle. Then, in March 1953, something strange happened. Stalin was staying at his private residence outside Moscow. After a long night with several top officials, he went to his room. The next morning, he didn't come out. His guards noticed that the lights were still on, but were too terrified to check on him. Stalin had created an atmosphere where disturbing him could be seen as a serious offense, so for hours, no one entered the room. Eventually, after an entire day passed without any sign of him, the guards finally went inside. Stalin was lying on the floor, unable to speak, soaked in his own urine. He had suffered a massive stroke. Doctors were called, but treatment came far too late. Stalin lingered for several days, partially conscious and unable to communicate. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Some historians believe the delay in medical treatment sealed his fate. Others have speculated that members of his inner circle may have intentionally waited, knowing that helping him quickly might keep him alive and keep them trapped under his rule. In the end, the man who had ruled through fear and paranoia died surrounded by the very system of fear he had created.